Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a really wild intersection, where hard endocrinology meets ancient esoteric mythology. We're going to objectively map out some incredibly fascinating and frankly complex claims from our sources regarding the pineal gland, melatonin, and their supposed roles in elite bloodline rituals. Basically, we're exploring how actual biological functions have been interpreted by certain texts as the literal foundation for legends of vampires, dragons, and transcendent states of consciousness. It's a lot to unpack, so let's get into it.
Here's how we're going to break this down today. We'll start with the biology in Section 1, the command gland, and Section 2, melatonin and cellular rejuvenation. Then we'll look at the aging process in Section 3, brain sand and calcification. After that, things get esoteric in Section 4, starfire and dragon bloodlines, before we bring it all together in Section 5, vampirism, light, and transcendence.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the command gland, biology and mysticism.
So according to the source texts, the pineal gland acts as the absolute command center for your entire endocrinal system. Now physically, it's just this tiny, pea-sized organ nestled right deep inside the brain. But historically, it carries immense weight. The 17th century philosopher René Descartes famously called it the seat of the soul. And in the esoteric texts we're looking at, it isn't just a biological regulator. It's literally viewed as a physical antenna. They describe it as a mediator of inspiration that takes intuitive or even cosmic information and translates it into something the human body can actively process.
Chemically speaking, this tiny gland pumps out a highly potent cocktail of psychotropic hormones directly into our bloodstream. It secretes melatonin, whose name literally translates to the night worker, and it regulates serotonin. It also produces pinealine and DMT, which are heavily associated with visionary and mystical states. But here's what the sources highlight as absolutely crucial. The pineal gland is unique because it's largely unprotected by the blood-brain barrier. It's a master sensor, meaning it's intimately connected to our external environment, especially the cycles of light and darkness.
Moving right along, let's look at Section 2, melatonin and cellular rejuvenation.
Now here's where the physiological claims in the texts get really specific. They state that the thyroid gland produces a hormone called thyroxin-4, or T4. But T4 is often totally inactive on its own. It's of little use for driving your metabolic rate. According to the sources, pineal melatonin acts as the catalyst that converts that T4 into thyroxin-3, or T3, and the texts literally describe this activated T3 as rocket fuel. This conversion supposedly triggers a massive biological feedback loop that stimulates the body's cells to behave like a nuclear reactor, churning out huge amounts of ATP energy to completely rejuvenate the system.
And keeping those melatonin levels high, the sources say it's an absolute game changer. We're talking about a supercharged immune system, lower cancer risks, surging physical stamina, and incredibly powerful anti-aging properties, since melatonin is the body's most effective antioxidant. Plus, it's noted for being able to override estrogen to balance out the whole hormonal system. Beyond just the physical stuff, this high pineal activity is said to heighten intuitive knowledge and open the door to transcendent states of consciousness. The texts basically present melatonin as a panacea, a true biological and spiritual catalyst.
But, of course, nothing lasts forever. That brings us to Section 3, brain sand and calcification.
There's a very real medical reality to how this gland ages, known as corpora arenacea, which translates directly to brain sand. Over time, calcium and magnesium salts naturally deposit themselves concentrically inside the pineal gland. When you're younger, these calcifications might just be globular, but as you age, they become lamellated and effectively harden the tissue itself.
According to the esoteric texts, this calcification is basically the biological villain of our story. As the pineal gland succumbs to this brain sand and lays down those calcium salts, it heavily inhibits that critical production of melatonin. Essentially, it turns off that cellular nuclear reactor we just talked about. And without that rocket fuel, the body experiences cellular atrophy, aging, and, most tragically, according to the sources, a total separation from higher frequencies and transcendent awareness. So, how did ancient elites supposedly fight back against this aging process? Let's dive into Section 4, starfire and dragon bloodlines. To combat natural aging and pineal calcification, the texts claim that ancient elite bloodlines engaged in some highly secretive practices to artificially manipulate their chemistry. They relied on the ritual ingestion of a substance they called starfire. The sources define starfire as female endocrine secretions, specifically menstrual blood and vaginal fluids, which are incredibly rich in live melatonin, serotonin, and oxytocin.
By consuming this directly, these elites believed they could literally bypass their own body's natural limits of hormonal production.
The sources get very specific and pretty vivid about how this was carried out. They describe it as a consensual, highly ritualized tradition among a ruling class. These fluids were sourced exclusively from virgin women within their own specific lineage, women who were revered as Grail maidens or dragon princesses. To these elites, this was a sacred mechanism for extracting the ultimate genetic and hormonal essence they felt they absolutely needed to maintain their power, youth, and foresight.
And what did ingesting this starfire supposedly achieve? Well, the texts claim certain dragon bloodlines possess larger pineal glands with more melatonin-sensitive receptors, which they refer to as dragon synapses. Consuming starfire directly stimulated these synapses, inducing massive cellular rejuvenation. And here's one of the wilder claims from the sources. For human-reptilian hybrids, the hormonal harmonics of this human blood literally instructed their DNA to maintain a mammalian-human appearance. Crucially, by doing this consensually, they completely avoided the toxic stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline that would ruin the blood if it were violently extracted from a terrified victim.
Which leads us perfectly into our final section, Section 5, Vampirism, Light and Transcendence.
Basic biology tells us that environmental light, especially daylight and blue light, actively destroys and inhibits melatonin production. It can even shrink the pineal gland over time. Because of this, the sources argue that these elite rejuvenation rituals, what they term royal vampirism, strictly required the darkness. Absolute darkness is what fosters massive melatonin synthesis and enables what they call a spiritual quickening. Because these blood-drinking elites had to operate strictly at night to preserve the melatonin, they inadvertently birthed the eternal archetype of the nocturnal vampire hiding from the sun.
The texts actually trace these specific bloodlines way back to ancient groups like the Amalekites, whose very name meant blood lickers. And here's a fascinating physiological side effect. Scientifically, high doses of melatonin can actually cause your skin to become ghostly pale. So you can see how the literal consumption of melatonin-rich blood maps perfectly onto the legendary traits of vampires: pale skin, nocturnal habits, and shape-shifting abilities. The sources even suggest this paleness is the historic foundation for the biblical Mark of Cain.
Ultimately, it all boils down to this core claim from the esoteric texts. Taking a modern, synthetic hormone pill is completely useless compared to raw, biological extraction. To these ancient elites, only the live, ritually extracted hormones taken from a human source could unlock true cellular rejuvenation and spiritual transcendence. In this view, the entire mythology of the vampire is just a misunderstood cultural memory of some extreme glandular alchemy.
So, as we wrap up this explainer and process these wild intersections of endocrinology and myth, the texts leave us with a pretty profound question. In our modern world, we are constantly bombarded by artificial blue light, right? It creates this chronic darkness deficiency. Well, if the pineal gland is truly the command center of our spiritual and physical vitality, is this light pollution merely giving us insomnia? Or, as the sources suggest, has it completely severed our ancient connection to higher states of consciousness? Are we locking away our own spiritual potential, dictated by the microscopic chemistry right inside our own brains? It is definitely a fascinating thought to leave you with. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the source material.